Hello, people, last class. So, I'll just start it, right? So, this is the last lecture of the environmental nexus class for this year. You guys, by this time, should know what the environmental nexus is. You know, we've talked all semester about the climate, the food, the water, and the biodiversity problems. Let's start with some bookkeeping because we don't want to run over and not do this. This is about the final exam and so on. So the final is at 9 a.m. in Frick B02. It's sort of downstairs in Frick, I think, right? Isn't that the downstairs thing when you get into Frick? Now, it is extremely complicated to figure out what happens, and so you have to have a math PhD, so pay attention. The final, remember, is determining 30% of your grade, right? And 2/3 of the final is focused on the second half of the course, because the midterm determines 20% of the grade. And 1/3 of the final exam is cumulative, all right? It's short answer essay, just like the midterm, for the most part, but some questions will require a full page, right? Or more, right? So you can't be sure about that. As before, 2/3 to 3/4 of the questions are common to all the different sections. But that means 1/3 to 1/4 are specific to your section. All right? And that's it. Now, if you can determine how much of the material is, you can use this to determine how much of the material is cumulative and how much of it is from the second half of the course. And if you sort of think it through, the majority of the exam is you can think of the exam as being 50-50, with 50% a second midterm, and the other 50% a cumulative final exam. And so that means that if you take the cumulative part that's from the second half of the course, that's why we say it's 2/3 focused on the second half, right? Because that goes with the half that was really like a second midterm. So the important thing is that you do have to take a look at the first half of the class, but it is only for a half of 1/3 of the exam. All right, so 1/6. Everybody got that? Are there any questions? I'm sure you're all, you know. Huh? All right. So yeah. All right. Isn't that clear? Good. There are also 2 review sessions. One is May 18th at 3 p.m. in Peyton Hall 145, which is here. And the second is on May 21st at 5 p.m., also here. And all of us will be here, all the teachers will be here for the second one, and everybody but Professor Nixon will be here for the first one. Okay? And your preceptor will also be holding a review section for the material restricted to your precept, and you can see the blackboard center for that. All right? And this is why we say the Nexus course is complicated. All right. Now, I want to do just a run through of what it is we've learned, and this is going to be a little tag team. Everybody's going to weigh in. The science and technology version of the Nexus problem is first and foremost that the consequences from business as usual are serious. You put them all together and you get really serious consequences from business as usual. It's very difficult to do the calculation and come up with less than tens of millions of human deaths between now and mid-century, like World War II. All right? So this is a large body count. With the mass extinction, and with hundreds of trillions of dollars in costs, all right? The costs really pile up if you add them up correctly. And so this is a really serious problem. I don't know if it's existential, but it's really costly, right? To be avoided if one can. But fortunately, there are scientifically sound and technologically ready solutions still open to humanity, and that means you. So what are these? Well, if we limit warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius, if we stop the expansion of agricultural land, if we manage fisheries with catch shares, if we increase crop yields with fertilizer, particularly in Africa, if we reduce food waste, if we encourage modest diet shifts, especially away from beef, and if we price water where it's in scarce supply, and promote international trade of food, which effectively trades water, then we can actually solve all these problems simultaneously. Now that's a lot, but it's not a crazy amount, okay? It's not a crazy amount, and the technologies for all of these actions are already available. I say with the exception of grid-scale electricity storage, which appears to be coming, but the alternative, carbon capture and storage on natural gas plants, is available now, all right? So there are multiple options for that. So we've got all the technology we need, and it's just a matter of doing it. And moreover, all of these trends are already in motion, all right? It's not like we sort of haven't started. So emissions in real terms in developed nations are declining. Per capita emissions, most places are declining also, like for instance in China. The clearance of new land for agriculture is actually lower than it was. We appear to be over the top of the Kuznets curve for deforestation in most places. We are starting to manage our fisheries sensibly because it turns out fishermen are happier when we do. There is a steady increase in crop yields per hectare. We aren't reducing food waste. We should. We are, in developed nations at least, experiencing modest diet shifts away from beef. Not away from meat, but away from beef and in favor of poultry. So there are a lot there's a lot of motion in this direction. Pricing water, everybody knows we should do it, but politically that's proven difficult. But as the problems worsen, it looks like California is actually sort of getting forced into it, kind of getting backed into it, where for the people who hold historic water rights, it turns out to just be untenable eventually, and they're kind of forced to do it. So this, and the technology on the climate change problem has really developed. I mean, all of a sudden the cheapest form of energy is not emitting. And that happened almost during the course. I mean, that wasn't true at the beginning of last semester, and it's true now. Right? So this is a spectacular sort of harbinger that maybe we could do something like this. Now, additional damages are inevitable. So solving the Nexus problems doesn't mean like solving a problem. Like, it's not usually what you think of when you solve the problem. So even the greenest feasible solution includes lots of species lost, millions dead, trillions of dollars in damages. All right, so if that's a win, all right, whatever, okay? But averted damages will be far more serious. Thing always to remember, everybody asks me everywhere I speak, including yesterday, I spoke at a gig in New York. Everybody wants to know, have we waited too late? Is it too late? They always want to know, is it too late? And that's the wrong way to think about it. We're in the portion of this space here where damages are concave up. They're a concave up function of cumulative emissions, meaning that every year the damages are worse than they were the year before. And every year the rate at which the damages increase is faster than the rate at which it increased last year. And this means any time you stop, it's way better than keeping going, okay? You've averted more damage than you've experienced. Okay, so that's just the way it is. We're partway up this curve, and the idea is to stop ASAP. In addition to that, remember we talked about tipping point, deglaciation and the loss of coastal cities, mass extinctions that occur if you lose a climate, for instance, for an important biome like tropical rainforests. Deep sea circulation ceasing because of the plugging of the drain of the oceans between Iceland and Europe. tropical famine from excess heat in the tropical countries. But again, the Paris goal, which is 1.5 or 2 degrees, is substantially below where we think these big tipping, nonlinear tipping points are. So the way to think about the problem where we are is in this sort of concave up accelerating damages business. But if we just let it go, we also risk huge sort of nonlinear events that would be almost qualitative. So we want to avoid those. The one we may not avoid is that deglaciation over the very long term, millennia, could still create problems. But millennia are a long, long time. And I don't know where humanity is going to be technologically in millennia, but we might well have the capacity to do quite a bit of this. If you're ever wanting to read something that shows how inexpensive large-scale like terraforming projects could become, John von Neumann, the sort of parent of modern computing, who worked at the Institute and did like a zillion things. He was the smartest guy, maybe one of the smartest people of the century, right? Famous for how smart he was. And he wrote a book that was partway finished by the time he died it was on the economics of self-reproducing automatons. Okay? So you had to read this, fantastic. Right? Unfortunately, his son tried to finish it. Everything his son wrote, you can see where the BS begins. And right, so stop. Okay. So, but accelerating damages are already among us. And one of the things that really worries me about the accelerating damages that we understand is that I don't think we may understand really how the most important damages. And in particular, we looked at the work by Solomon Chang and others on the relationship between climate and climate change and conflict. All right? How much conflicts change when the climate changes, probably mostly because of food shocks, food price shocks and food availability shocks. And so this is worrisome because in none of the economic models I know, this isn't taken account of. Right? So to some significant extent, we may be missing the dominant economic terms, to say nothing of the dominant sort of ethical terms. Right? It's real suffering, human conflict. As I said, the Paris solution, which is that dark blue curve, caps us within this region where we don't think the nonlinear stuff is going to happen. And although the damages are concave up and we'd like to end earlier, you can see that the Paris solution is really just about an acknowledgement that damages are concave up and accelerating. And we're just trying to stop it. I mean, just trying to stop it as close as we can, right? And if you try to accelerate it too fast, the economy tanks because it gets really expensive. And then poor people suffer. Right? The rich people go from being really rich to sort of rich, and the poor people go from being poor to desperate, right? But the technological endgame that we talked about that's just become available, this is the most optimistic part of the story for me. So we have technology in hand for an all-electric economy fueled by solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, gas with carbon capture and storage, and a cost about what we pay for electricity today. The cost for the sort of producer is about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. You can see that the average person in the US retail pays 12 cents, all right? So that's pretty good, right? So the question is now, how do we go about as a society swapping out the old kit for the new? And I think that the economics of this problem are unexplored. I imagine the next time we do the Nexus course, we'll talk about, what's the difference when you know what it is you want to buy, all right? And so market solutions aren't necessarily necessary if you know what you want to purchase, right? So that's the question. It's very interesting. So this is all too good to do. The elephant in the room is, of course, Donald Trump. And Pruitt, although he does appear to be on his way out, I must say. Well, I don't know. It's a new thing every day. right? There's another big new one to do, you know. Yeah. Fortunately, he is a crook, I think, so that's good. All right, so, but on the other hand, if you actually look at what the Republicans who are in power have accomplished, we've got this collection of subsidies for the end game on the climate problem that we didn't have under Obama. And whether or not anybody knew they were doing it, the point is it's getting done. All right? There's some evidence-based decision makers at work somewhere, right, in the world. The world hasn't just kind of, decided to make stuff up. And if you actually look at what the executive branch has accomplished on the environmental side, it is precious little right now, right? Actually not accomplished anything other than to stop enforcing some rules, which any administration has the ability to do, the slow regulation and that sort of thing. So it's just not clear right now where any of that, the elephant. Yeah, the elephant may just end up standing in the room and then be gone, right? I don't know. We'll see on this problem. The problem, as you know, to solve it, the problem is that we've got double cropland to meet double demand, and that would come from primary forest, and we'd have a mass extinction. And also we've got this problem that climate change reduces yields. And it reduces yields because of direct effective heat, but also primarily because of effects on water availability, right? Heat goes up, water evaporates more, so even in places where rainfall doesn't change, plants have less water available. That's just the interaction of all the Nexus problems here, right? The food problem is related to all these others. Already said what the solution was. I like Foley's, but there are lots of these, and they're all reasonably feasible. The biodiversity problem, this is a slide from the very first lecture. The solution, the Paris solution to the climate change without agricultural land expansion, which Foley has argued for, gives you 11% as the total number of species extinctions from habitat conversion. But that's the number we've already arrived at given the habitat area we have now. And there is, because of the long time delay between now and when you would lose all of those species, there is the possibility that as technology changes over a time scale of a century or more, we may be able to significantly reduce the agricultural land. It's hard to know, all right? But at least 11% is not as bad as 60. Water problem, there's a 50% global demand growth expected by mid-century, which will lead to regional shortage. Climate change affects this. And the solution is where water becomes scarce to do water cap and trade, to have tradable water allotments the way we talked about, and to promote international trade in food. And this does not mean that there can't be a local food movement, all right? They build local food. Catherine reminded me that there are other reasons why you want to have a local food distribution. To build community, there are all kinds of other reasons. But at the same time, if we're going to meet our international obligations to people who become food insecure, what we really need to do there, I think, unless we can figure out how to open borders in some other way, let people move easily, which is very difficult. I think we're going to have to promote international trade in food. Make it non-local. So this is the summary. The science and technology story is in some sense, in my mind, kind of complete. Kind of understand that we've got a really serious problem here. And we kind of have the technology and policy to solve it. So we'll still learn stuff from the science, but especially with this energy system that's cheaper than what we have today, all of a sudden we're in a position where the science and technology academic enterprise is almost going to get boring because we know what to do. And the real impediments now are economic, political, ethical, and imaginative. This is really a problem that is shifting very much outside the domain of science and technology, where it has been. And so, on to the other parts of the course. Okay. People who are inheriting, in some sense, this problem.
Okay, so I'll be dealing with the wrong side of the problem. Where are the difficulties? And so as we've seen in this course, even if the understanding of the physical processes is good, and even if the technologies for finding solutions are there, it's unlikely that spontaneously the mass of people, of agents, economic agents, firms, and so on will move directly to the solution just by themselves. And why that? Because in the Nexus, in all the aspects of the Nexus problem, we have this phenomena of commons, public goods, and externalities, which are typically phenomena where individual initiative, private rationality doesn't lead to socially optimal solutions, right? So I think I don't need to go over the details of that, but it's essentially prisoner's dilemma everywhere in this setting. And so this is just a slide we had which summarizes the various ways in which in various parts of the Nexus you have this phenomenon. So if we want to look for solutions for a better management of this issue, we have seen two sorts of issues. So first, what are the analytical tools to look for solutions? And there are two main things, two main approaches. One is the cost effectiveness analysis, which looks at how to build scenarios and try to find the least costly ways of moving, of transitioning toward the green way. And you may remember these consortium building scenarios with big models analyzing how the various industries and sectors of the economy can move and change their technologies and their investments and so on. And there is the question of if we want to look at the benefits of doing that and weighing the benefits with respect to the cost of this transition, we need to do something that's a bit more ambitious, which is cost-benefit analysis, in order to find what transition would be better balancing the cost and the benefits. And this is where the integrated assessment models play a role with the loop between the economy and the climate through the emissions and the damages. There is one issue we didn't really talk about, we don't have much time for that, and I wanted to flag it, which is the issue of co-benefits. So if we transition toward the green way, we will also clean the air. That's good for reducing air pollution, improving health situation of many people. And so in the analysis, in the basic analysis of the benefits of climate policy, this sort of additional consideration is usually not factored in. And so some people have been talking about that a lot. And the IPCC reports have been always spending sections and sometimes chapters on, or even special working groups on this. But it is not so easy to really evaluate that and put it together with the standard analysis. But there is ongoing work, and the results seem to be showing that indeed these additional benefits can be very large. And I'm just talking about things that can be measured like health benefits, but there are many things perhaps which are much harder to measure, which have to do with the different community life that people may have when they move toward a different lifestyle and so on. So there are many things like that which are way out of the current perspectives of measurement and integrating all of that. There has been a lot of hype about the double dividend of carbon policy, and actually some controversy around the fact that perhaps people have a bit exaggerated this issue. So the idea was, if you impose a carbon tax, you can have new revenues for the state, and then you can reduce other taxes, and that will improve the situation in the economy. And that, so the first analysis of this thing was a bit exaggerated, and now people have reduced a little bit their excitement about this perspective. Because if there are some imperfections elsewhere in the economy, you can also somehow tackle them right away. You don't need to wait for a carbon tax to arrive. So there has been perhaps a bit too much optimism about that at some point. But these are interesting issues I wanted to mention. And then we've talked about the policy instruments, what can be done. And so the kind of pricing mechanisms are two things, the sort of dual tools. You can have an emissions market or market for permits, or you can have a tax or a system of taxes and subsidies, which are essentially very similar in the way they work, with slight difference in terms of whether you know in advance what the price will be, or whether you have some idea of what the quantity of emission will be. But you have other tools, so regulation and education can play a role as well, and ethical norms can play a role in changing people's behavior. And part of this section also includes politics, right? So even if we have the good economic solutions, the good idea of what the trajectory should be, we may be completely unable to implement it because politics is politics, and you have sometimes several elephants in the room, and they are all pretty bad at implementing things. And so the lectures on politics have shown that it's important to remember the different philosophy between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. The Kyoto Protocol was a sort of top-down thing, and there was no incorporation of the developing countries in the picture. The Paris Agreement is a bottom-up thing, voluntary pledges, and everyone is included. There is no guarantee Paris will succeed. It is very weak on incentives and transparency, and it may work if some countries take the leadership. So people used to say China and the US. Now they say China. Okay, we'll see how the future evolves. And we have two lectures, and I'd like to remind you that the two lectures are relevant for the exam, so don't forget them. So we had a lecture by Scott Barrett, interestingly mentioning that this perspective that in fact will somehow come full circle when we look at the various stages of the UNFCCC creation and the various rounds of discussions. Now we are back to sort of voluntary plans, and Professor Barrett has been a bit pessimistic about the idea that pledges and reviews can really change what people do. He said it can change what people say, but not necessarily what they do. But he had some ideas about tools which could be effective, for instance, linking trade agreements to climate negotiation in order to have ways of incentivizing participation and potentially punishing those who fail to cooperate. And he did mention the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which is something that has to do with greenhouse gases, the FHE, which are quite potent in terms of greenhouse effect. And so there are things which can work perhaps in this direction, but I'm not sure we can really hope a lot happening very soon. And there is this perspective of the technological solution, which might change the nature of the political process itself. Because if you can bring in business interest to push for solutions, that can create new coalitions. And this is something that Professor Cohen did insist on. So he also, like Professor Barrett, acknowledged that the Paris Agreement is organized hypocrisy. But on the other hand, it may encourage some national action, and he reminded us of the important work that in our Armstrong on how to manage the commons problem and the ways, the conditions with which you can do that. So restricting access, creating incentives, building reciprocity. And he had lessons at the end of his slides, which are, I think, important. Domestic politics is crucial, so that's the elephant. Democracy does not guarantee success, that's also the elephant. We should build coalitions with industry, and we should get institutional incentives right. So that's economics and politics. What about ethics?
So as we've been talking about all along, there are these fundamental disagreements, and it seems that we have disagreements about, I think, less whether or not as we were just talking about, whether or not these disagreements are about whether these problems exist. That part seems pretty obvious and pretty clear. And the real question is how to get something done. And part of what I wanted to just highlight and what we've been able to do over the course of the class is we've been able to ask questions about if we're to take a step back and think about how would we convince each other, our politicians, people who are in the business world, how would we convince them to start thinking differently about these core values, these, as it says here, about attitudes to risk or well-being or political beliefs, And we talked a little bit at the very beginning about this all seems so mysterious, and maybe it's just my own opinion, and me as an individual, what can I possibly do? Well, we have a whole bunch of ethical tools now for thinking about reasoning through some of these ethical questions. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about a lot of the tools that we have for not just thinking about what we as individuals might be able to do, but how we might be able to take the elephant in the room, as it were. If the elephant in the room had some sort of ethical orientation, now that we're just going to have to take. Maybe the elephant in the room has no ethical orientation, and I'm afraid, sadly, that might be the case. But if the elephant in the room does have some ability to think about anything beyond themselves, what might we do to reach some sort of agreement? How can we move together? So one of the things we talked about early on are to really identify different ways in which values animate these differences, whether they're intrinsic values or instrumental values. Now, sometimes instrumental values, thinking about the natural world as just something that's valuable because of what it does for humanity or does for us, that can get us really far. We don't have to posit that there's something intrinsic about the natural world that needs to be preserved, particularly when we're at the kind of impasse that we often find ourselves in. There's also a really important way in which we need to identify, as we've been doing all semester, the kinds of harms that occur, and I'll get to this in a minute, the way they're not fairly or equitably distributed, these harms. Some people are much, much better off than other people. And so we could actually start to talk with each other and talk with policymakers and think together about how it is that we can make some remedies to this sort of distribution of benefits and burdens, losses of value. And part of the way we can do that is by focusing on responsibility. And we talked a lot about the different ways that we can understand responsibility. If somebody's thinking about responsibility merely in a causal way, hey, I didn't do that, I didn't contribute to that problem, it's not my responsibility. And somebody else is thinking about responsibility as, well, you know, I have a lot of resources here, maybe there was a bit of moral luck that got me all these resources. You need to start to figure out a way to argue and reason about the in-between space. And we've looked at the ways that we might be able to do that. One of the things that's really important, I think, is thinking about our ethical understanding. How are we going to make all of us, how are we going to figure out ways beyond the differences? How are we going to reach any agreements? Is to try to come to terms with what we take to be important sense of equality. And again, we talked about very different ways that we can think about what equality is. We might be thinking about equality in terms of the outcome. That's a lot of what the economic analysis has us do, is think about equality in terms of outcome. But it might also matter tremendously in terms of our imaginative possibilities. If we can get people up to the same level, it might turn out that people who haven't really been exposed to the science and the economics and the political sort of tools that are available for thinking about these problems, they might have a fresh way of thinking about it. So there's a really exciting way of thinking that if we could provide, let's say, equal access to mechanisms for understanding these problems, we might actually come up with new solutions. And we also talked a little bit about justice, and I wanted to say a couple of things. So we talked about different ways of thinking, and we got a lecture on not just participatory justice, but participatory research, and thinking about how to solve environmental injustice, problems of environmental injustice or environmental racism. But we didn't talk about, and that's why there's a little asterisk here, and so I wanted to just take 2 minutes, if I could, to say a little bit about restorative justice and by focusing just a tiny bit on empathy. So restorative justice is this idea that if we've caused a harm, or if we're engaged in a project in which we benefit and we didn't really deserve to benefit, that we might want to actually restore the harm or somehow rectify the harm. Now, when we just were talking about millions of deaths, there's not much you can do to restore that harm. So if restorative justice is an idea that motivates you from an ethical point of view, you really want to get people to understand that if restorative justice is what justice demands, and you're looking at engaging in activities that are going to cause millions of deaths, you can't ever restore, that should give you pause. That itself should motivate people who might be elephants in the room that are reasonable to think about what we're doing. Some kinds of harms, some kinds of losses, we can't make right again. And so that, I think, is an important motivation for thinking ethically and being more animated about finding solutions. The other thing I wanted to mention just was this empathy idea. One of the things that we're really bad at is thinking about the perspective of others. And so one of the central tools of doing ethical reasoning is to try to put yourself in the position of another. And we did get to see what it was like to be living in the North Slope of Alaska, on tundra that's changing so drastically. We did get to see what it's like to be living in Kenya and discovering the ways in which the landscape is changing. And so I think part of the real tool for thinking ethically is to try to develop our capacities towards empathy, to be able to put ourselves in the position of another and to imagine what it's like to be them, what it's like to maybe lose someone because of rising seawater, what it's like to be losing someone because the ice that was always frozen wasn't frozen, the snow machine went in. So I think that this is a really important part of the overall project we're doing, and the arts and the imagination help us in our development of empathy. So I will turn it over to
Yeah, that's a very good place to kick in. This question of perspective. A lot of what we've talked about in discussing the films and images in the art section has been the jolt that a shift in perspective can have, and the way that that can ripple through ethically and politically in terms of policy. And part of the challenge with this facet of the course, and the ethical to some extent as well, is that we're trying to articulate the measurable to the immeasurable. And so one of the things that we've seen in a variety of different examples over the course of this channel of the course, as it were, is the efforts of different artists to create kind of imaginative disturbances or tipping points that shift the assumed perceptual fields that we're operating in. And so one of the examples that we talked about is the Anthropocene, the idea, the paradigm shift, if you like, that in terms of Earth's biogeochemistry, for the first time we have a sentient species, that it has jolted the planet into a new epoch. Okay, so we have Anthony Barnowski, a renowned biologist, who uses the very dramatic figurative example of "we are the asteroid." Okay, this idea of a kind of an imaginative effort to articulate this as and envisage it as a collision. Okay, and so something that we talk about in all of the art materials is the use of figurative language and the use of imagery to try to animate these disturbances and to shift business as usual thinking, if you like, using the imaginative domain. One of the examples that we talked about was the theatre of the ocean floor, with particular emphasis on the underwater sculptures of Jason DeCaris Taylor. And both the Anthropocene asteroid example and DeCaris' sculpture bring in this question of scale, because one of the challenges we face is feeling our way into these vast temporal and geographical spatial scales. And so if we come back to Laurie's point, this question of how do we engage empathetically across distance, generational distance, and spatial identity. And so in thinking about the imagery of the VW on the sea floor, we talked a little bit about the ambiguity of the figure on the windshield. The degree where that figure meant to signify the kind of slumbering humanity, somebody in a fetal position, the collapse of environmental time, the solidifying of that time in terms of the era of high carbon consumption, and the way that the scuba divers on the surface have an otherworldly aspect, a sort of angelic presence, looking down not only across space but as if across time. Okay? So we've seen many, many examples of artists trying to give a visceral and aesthetic presence to these great expanses of time and space. Okay? We also talked about a little bit about polar bears and the way in which, come back to the Paris Accord, these sculptures did double duty. They were made out of glacial fragments and spoke to both the melting of the ice and the risk of species extinction. So the medium and the message are articulated together in ways that speak to questions of water and the fate of the cryosphere, and also the fate of megafauna in this case. Okay? And here too, what we see is an attempt to accelerate expanses of time that are all very difficult to feel and to enter into, so that the speeding up of the melt here brings us into that space of collapse, accelerated time. And I refer to this quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which I'll just briefly read again. Racism is a visceral experience that dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. Okay? So this idea of what are the bodily effects? What do we feel in our body? And this applies both to violence and to hope. But what Ta-Nehisi Coates was writing about here, and largely in reference to Black Lives Matter, is applicable to the Nexus cause, to this question of how do we think through the sociology, the graphs, the charts, and the regression, as well as the embodied effects that those charts and graphs are gesturing towards. Okay? And one of the contexts in which we thought about this question of racism and inequality that Laurie referred to was in the context of Even the Rain and the Bolivian Cochabamba water struggle. And one of the things that was brought to the fore by that particular film was the degree to which, if we're looking forward from the present to 2050, how we look forward is going to be refracted through our very particular cultural pasts. And one of the things that the film dramatizes, I think, very effectively is the degree to which colonial indigenous relations to resources like water and gold impact the way that indigenous people in Cochabamba responded to outsiders trying to come in and monetize a vital resource in terms of water. Finally, we also talked a lot about alliances and the degree to which contingent environmental alliances between different groups go beyond the environment in their consequences. And this is something that links to both what Mark said and Steve at the beginning. The degree to which something like the Greenbelt movement's tree planting became an act of civic regeneration that had consequences for the women's movement, for student movement, trade union movement, for the larger pushback against authoritarianism. And so we talked about, just as we talked about the underwater sculptures and the symbolic theatre of the seafloor, so we talked about the theatre of the tree, the symbolic theatrical side of the saplings that were wielded against the military and the police who were fighting with violent weapons, and the degree to which the civil disobedience of tree planting was recognized very widely across these alliances as people articulating a different set of temporal values that were environmental but also more than environmental. Okay.
I think we can skip to the question. I just wanted to thank you all for being in the course. Many of you were engaged and interested, and all of you were unfailingly polite. And this is not to be taken for granted in this world. And so my experience is that nurture is much more important than nature. And so what I want you to do is to go thank whoever raised you, because they did a good job. So thanks for being here. We've enjoyed teaching you.